All right, guys, just wanted to start off with chapter 7, just kind of a recap for you guys. We're going to do all of chapter 7. I'll have a preceding video for number 8, so be on the lookout for that. But one of the things that I wanted to reemphasize for your exam coming up next week, chapter 7 and chapter 8. Chapter 7 in particular is crucially important in American history, so we're going to spend a lot of time focusing in on it to make sure that we are squared away and we have everything we need to know about it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and you will see where we are on chapter 7. And so right here, this is where you'll want to begin. We talked a bit about this beforehand. So I'm going to kind of gloss over it a little bit, but I just want to remind you, after chapter 6, we had a lot of lingering questions in our fledgling nation. What do we do now? Questions about equality, questions about slavery, questions about the common person, and that should that person have a voice or should it be run by elites? What about religion? What do we do in our country? Okay, now we have our country, and it's been a few years now. We have a very loose Articles of Confederation. We'll talk about that. In our fledgling nation, we had a constitutional Congress, a continental Congress rather, that had been very loosely associated under the Articles of Confederation right here. So the Articles were not particularly strong. They did not really lay any sort of groundwork for how the U.S. could pay its bills, for how we could decide representation, who should vote, how do we collect revenue. There were a whole lot of questions and not a whole lot of answers. All we had at that time was one House of Congress. We did not have any executive. And so from that standpoint, there just wasn't a whole lot of direction under the Articles of Confederation in the years immediately in the aftermath of the signing of the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War. So we have our own country, but we're very loosely associated. But speaking of having our own country, as part of that Treaty of Paris, the United States gained all sorts of territory all the way into the Great Lakes region and all the way west to the Mississippi River. The United States doubled its territory, more than doubled really, from the original 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard, from New England down to Chesapeake down to Georgia. And then we moved west, now beyond the Appalachian mountain chain. So all of the Great Lakes region that you know today, all the way to the Mississippi River. And part of that was the Northwest Territory, these states that you see here, modern day Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio, parts of Minnesota. This region right here in the 1780s was known as the Northwest Territory. And the entire reason why 20 some odd years prior, the French and Indian War had been fought was the British really loved this Ohio Valley, a lot of flat, very fertile land in the Great Lakes region, access to fresh water. It would be ideal for agriculture and therefore settlement. Well, 20 some odd years later, it's now a part of the new United States of America, and you had a lot of American settlers who eyeballed it for settlement. The U.S. government didn't quite have the authority to prevent people from trying to spill into it, but they recognized that this gigantic territory, the Northwest Territory, could eventually be not just ripe for settlement, but as it's such a big area, you could eventually have a territory that can be divided into future states. So how do you divide that? How do you also equally represent settlement? And so the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 was passed that allowed for division of acreage, if you will, to be split into even square areas, divided evenly, split evenly, and therefore administered evenly. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 was passed to establish a Northwest government and also a way for there to be settlement done on a consistent, equal, and really, if you think about it, a consistent basis. So if you look at this area right here, here's Ohio right there. This green area in the southeast of Ohio is what's represented here. This number 7 plot right there is what's represented in this square, 6 square miles. Okay. And then each of these little squares within here are a 1 square mile section. So this green area is this right here. Number 7 in this green area is represented in this 6 square mile right here. Number 26 right here is represented in this square right here. And this little square can be divided. So A, for example, that's 320 acres, this top rectangle. A quarter of this square is 160 acres. An eighth of it is C, that's 80 acres, and then 40 acres as a 16th. And so the plot where various different high schools are, for example, Wiley High School in Wiley, Texas, is very likely to be on around 80 or so acres. Well, 80 acres would be represented in C right here in this little square. That's a pretty big plot of land. And if you owned land, you can do all kinds of things on it. 80 acres, really 320 acres, 640 acres, you can do a whole lot of growth. You can grow all kinds of crops. In this case, in Ohio, you're looking at things like wheat, corn, things along those lines that would be ripe for settlement. And so we talked in class about ordinances and a grid system. So we talked about the city of Boston and driving in there. The streets are convoluted and they crisscross this way. We talked about Dallas, Texas, and how you have the east-west orientation of the major streets in downtown Dallas, and then you get up to uptown, and it goes northwest to southeast as you go towards Love Field, and that's not north and south, and so it gets kind of a little bit confusing. We talked about my hometown, how it's on a grid system, east-west, north-south, and how easy it was to get it around because it was on a grid. This is the first grid right here, settled through the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And it was an attempt by our Continental Congress at the time of the Articles of Confederation to establish political representation, administration, eventual settlement, and eventual statehood for a number of these areas within the Northwest Territory. Okay, so you had a lot of people who wanted to spill over into the area just beyond the Appalachian mountain chain. This particular region right here, which is modern day Kentucky, parts of Tennessee, that's just on the other side of the Appalachian mountain chain. You had a number of classic outdoorsmen, such as Daniel Boone, who was a Virginian, who wanted to go into this newly settled area, into the Kentuck, which is a Native American name for the region you know today as Kentucky. So this was part of the United States now, but it wasn't settled. You had people that wanted to settle within it. But problem, you had a number of Native Americans, particularly those in the modern day Southeast, the 5 civilized tribes. We'll talk about that in a future chapter. Pretty sad history there. Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Seminoles, and the Muskogee peoples, who are the Creeks. Up north in the Great Lakes region, the Wyandot, Delaware, Mingo, the Miami, you had conflict. Native Americans saw continual encroachment upon their territory, and it was alarming to them, as you can imagine. They had a severe distrust of Europeans. They fought in wars with the French against the British, and now these new Americans, they didn't quite know what to expect. And so you had all these settlers coming in there. Naturally, there's going to be conflict. And so you had a number of Native American tribes who come into conflict. The biggest weakness, though, of the Articles of Confederation became the most apparent with Daniel Shays' rebellion. This right here is a representation of Daniel Shays, who was a former soldier in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. He was a patriot. And out in Western Massachusetts, in the years after the Revolution, he had settled out there. As part of his service, he was promised various compensation and plots of land in Western Massachusetts. Daniel Shays, after several years of the treating of, or I'm sorry, after several years after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, had never received any compensation, no money, none of the land he was promised, because the Articles of Confederation did not have the authority to pay debts, have money. There was no specific discretion. Daniel Shays led a rebellion in Western Massachusetts where he collected a number of his servicemen, friends of his, these guys out here in a similar situation who valiantly fought for American independence, who were likewise promised land and other compensation, but had never received anything from them. So Daniel Shays rounded up a number of these men. They led a rebellion, stormed into various different government offices, and the government was powerless to do anything about it. Eventually, cooler heads would prevail. So Daniel Shays is a little known event in American history, but it is critically important because Daniel Shays' rebellion exposed the complete incompetence and weakness of the Articles of Confederation. As the United States was a brand new and fledgling country, it was obvious the Articles of Confederation were just not going to cut it. They were just too weak. We needed something greater to glue all of our new states, former colonies, and now new states together. We have new territories like the Northwest Territory and whatnot. We need something greater to tie our fledgling country together and be the glue that keeps us all together. So, from that perspective, there would have to be something that would scrap the Articles of Confederation. So, Daniel Shays' rebellion, this little known event, is critically important in U.S. history because it exposed the weakness of the Articles of Confederation and it led to the creation of something far, far greater that you know today. So, this gentleman right here, that's Alexander Hamilton. He's on our $10 bill. Critically important. Alexander Hamilton, just like Benjamin Franklin, is one of our founding fathers, and also like Benjamin Franklin, he is a completely self-made person. Alexander Hamilton did not come from landed elite status. He wasn't like Thomas Jefferson or George Washington or James Madison, who were wealthy Virginians who owned land and a lot of property and therefore had money and status. Alexander Hamilton was an orphan in the British Caribbean islands, and he grew up quite poor. I believe it was Barbados, one of those British West Indian uh, Caribbean islands. There was a hurricane that hit the island and struck there, and it would be deemed that he would be moved to British North America, in this case, eventually winding up in New York. So Alexander Hamilton had kind of a chip on his shoulder. And Alexander Hamilton believed that he could be somebody of status, not because he was elite, but because he was very smart and he had a lot of drive. And he had a vision for America that really could glue everybody together with a strong centralized government, a federal government that could be the overarching umbrella for every single American, no matter where they lived in the country, and eventually the creation of a major bank that you know today as the Federal Reserve. Alexander Hamilton was critical in producing many of the different explanations for why we would need a greater constitution that justified having a strong federal government. Like him, a young Virginian named James Madison, a protege of guys like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, also believed in the strength of a federal government, therefore drafting many of the different aspects that would become known as the United States Constitution. A little bit unlike Alexander Hamilton, James Madison also believed in a strong federal government, but warned of some of the overarching tendencies of a broad-based centralized power that could oftentimes overreach and be tyrannical. So you're going to develop a little bit of a mindset one way or the other as Americans were drafting what would become the framework of our country. This is another depiction of Alexander Hamilton. He looks kind of tall in this picture. In reality, he was probably about 5'6" or 5'7", wasn't very tall. James Madison was also not super tall as well, kind of a short guy, about 5'4". Unlike these tall, gigantic guys, not that 6'2" is gigantic, but George Washington was over 6 feet tall, this taller figure. James Madison, not so much. I'm 5'10", so I'm about average height, right in the middle between all those guys. But one of the things became clear. You have people from various different populations across the states in America, and population is going to dictate representation. So, from this standpoint, as our Constitutional Congress came together, people in a meeting room just like this to draft from a blank slate our country. What are we going to have as representation? How should we have people affirm their voice in our country? how are various different regions going to display their power, and what does it mean for the lesser populated states? And this is where we have, at the Constitutional Convention, questions about who is represented and what. So, in the Constitutional Convention, Virginians laid out the Virginia Plan, which in reality was an idea for a legislature that would have two houses, an upper chamber and a lower chamber, both of which would have representation based upon state population. Of course, Virginia would suggest that. At the time, they were by far the most populous state in the United States, and they wielded a big stick, and they wanted to make sure that they had the rightful representation that their population dictated. Okay. The problem with that, though, is that if you have two chambers of Congress, both of which use population to determine representation, that's going to mean that the states like Virginia with the most population are going to be excessively powerful. Today, in 2025, the state of Texas has 40 congressmen in the House of Representatives. That's dictated because Texas is the second most populous state in the country. There are 30 million people that live here. We're going to have a lot of population representation as a result of it. California, they're the most populous state in the country with about 54 million people. They have 54 representatives in Congress. So from that standpoint, California, Texas, they're going to have an awful lot of representation in the modern House of Representatives. But what do you do about states like Wyoming? Wyoming, beautiful state, beautiful state. A little bit difficult to live there because of topography, weather, and other aspects that make it a little bit more difficult to settle, even as opposed to neighboring states like Colorado, for example. Wyoming has somewhere between 5 and 700,000 people. So 500,000, 700,000, that's not a lot. So because of their population, Wyoming is not going to have as many representatives in the House. However, they do deserve some sort of voice. They have one rep in the House, but how do you keep them from being completely drowned out by states like California and Texas? And these were questions that our forefathers thought of at the time that reared their head as Virginia was laying out their plan. Two-house legislature. On the flip side, you had New Jersey, which at the time was one of the lesser populated states. They believed there should only be one house in the legislature. And not just that, this house, every state should have an equal number of representatives. Fair idea. However, if you have one house and every state has the exact same number of reps, now you're going to give a little bit too much power to the lesser populated states. They're going to be overrepresented from their lesser status. So that could be a tyranny of the minority. And this therein explains some of the differences between a true democracy and a constitutional representative republic. Because the compromise between the Virginia and New Jersey plans was to take the best of both. Two houses from the Virginia plan, an upper chamber and a lower chamber. One of those houses, the lower chamber, you know today as the House of Representatives. Each state's number of representatives in that house would be determined based on their state population. Virginia at the time, most populous, they're going to have the most representatives in the House of Representatives. To borrow from the New Jersey plan, the other chamber, the upper chamber, which you know today as the U.S. Senate, every state's going to have two senators, regardless of population. So by having more representatives in the House of Representatives, the more populous states have a rightful, deep voice, determined based on the number of people in their states. To balance that out, in recognition that smaller states should have some sort of representation on some sort of a balanced and equitable standpoint, you're going to have the U.S. Senate. So Wyoming, which is the least populous state in the country, they only have one rep in the House of Representatives, but they have two senators. Texas, second most populous state in the country, we have 40 members of the House. But like Wyoming, we also have two senators. So it's not perfect. it's not the most perfect thing you're ever going to see. However, our balance between the Virginia and New Jersey plans, that compromise, does just that. It attempts to balance from a tyrannical majority and also a tyrannical minority. It's imperfect, but it's better than anything seen on the world scale, certainly to this point. And this is what makes our country different than a true democracy. A true democracy in Greek form is majority rule. Well, if you're constantly in the minority, you will never have any sort of voice. A republic takes the very best of democracy and attempts to balance it. And as imperfect as it may be at times, it certainly reduces tyranny. And so a republic form of representation is the best at least attempting to find a form of balance that all people can be best represented. To this point, there's never been anything better. And so from that standpoint, this is where we move. Now, also, the Electoral College. The United States is going to develop, based upon the principle of the United States Senate giving the lesser states at least some sort of a vote, you're going to develop an electoral college that is going to determine who would become president of the United States. So in 2024, Donald Trump won the popular vote. He had 2.5 million more votes than Kamala Harris did nationally. But the popular vote is not what determines who wins the election. The Electoral College does. It's essentially, based on a state's population, whichever candidate has the most votes in each state will get all of those states' electoral votes. And in this instance, Texas, for example, pretty wide margin, 56% to 43, went to Donald Trump. Donald Trump carried all 40 of Texas electoral votes. You need 270 today to win the election. Donald Trump carried 312. So he won the popular vote, sure, but in this reality, he won the majority of electoral votes. Therefore, he's president. Unquestionable. He also carried every single swing state, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Arizona, states that could go either way. Donald Trump carried all of them. He convincingly won. Okay. But otherwise, many people argue that this electoral college, let's do that, the electoral college is unfair and should be abolished. I can kind of go back and forth on that. But the reason for the Electoral College exists for much the same way that the United States Senate exists. You want to give lesser populated states at least some sort of a say in an election and therefore have some sort of balance, as imperfect as it is. The United States also operates on the federal system. So our founding fathers drafted framework for our government to work at the federal level while also recognizing that various different states have different economic and societal output. Today, California and Texas have different views on culture, politics, economics. Californians and Texans are both Americans, and under the federal system, we are all Americans that are subject to the United States federal government. However, in a true federal system, states are allowed autonomy to where they can have their own state legislatures, governments, governors that can dictate state affairs. In California, based upon their topography, based upon cultural aspects, based upon other things as part of their economy, they have certain values that they espouse, which are oftentimes quite different than those that are espoused in Texas, where our topography, our location, our economy is based differently than that of California. So we're both Americans, and as long as we satisfy federal law, we are provided the autonomy to do something about our own states. And that's the difference in a division of powers in a federalist society. We have the overarching federal government, but we also allow states to have their own autonomy. And so in Texas, we have the governor, and we also have our state legislature with a House and a Senate as well. And so from that standpoint, that's where you have another division of powers between the state and federal levels. However, another hallmark of a true republic representation is the idea of checks and balances. It would be determined that we would have a legislature, the House and the Senate, known as Congress together. The House, we discussed this a minute ago, based upon representation of the number of people that live in each state. The Senate, every state's going to have 2 senators regardless. However, what other aspects of government will there be? We need to have a judiciary, and then there would be a question about an executive. What exactly would that look like? And it would be determined we're going to have 3 separate branches of government. The legislative branch, which is Congress, the House and the Senate. The judicial branch, which would be our system of federal courts culminating with the United States Supreme Court. And the executive branch. There were questions at the time. Should the United States have a king? Kind of what, like how Europe, in the European mode, specifically Britain, maybe even France. However, we fought an entire war a decade prior against a tyrannical king. So it would be determined we don't want a monarchy. Let's have an executive that we will name as a president. And there would be elections for this president. The legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branches are all going to have equal powers. So today, Donald Trump has signed many different executive orders that have often been struck down in the federal court system because they've been deemed as a violation of the Constitution or whatnot. That is our judicial branch striking down an overreach of powers by one of the other branches, therefore being a check. And so different branches of government can check each other. Legislature like Congress could enact a law that the president might deem as being unlawful. The president has veto power. So the president has the authority to strike down certain congressional rulings. And vice versa with the judiciary. These 3 branches of government all have equal powers. No one branch is to have any more power than the other. And they often check each other. And so, like I mentioned, the Supreme Court or federal courts can strike down executive orders. The president can strike down various different congressional acts. No one branch will dominate. But from this standpoint, it's going to be a system of checks and balances, a separation of powers that is different than anything seen on the world scale. This has never been tried before. This is truly unique. We're creating a country from a blank slate, from scratch. And we're doing so with the lessons learned from the Revolutionary War about how to balance power. And that is something different that has occurred in world history to this point. It had never been done before. So the United States is truly extraordinary in that aspect. We are attempting to divide separate powers to provide checks and balances while also granting states autonomy over their specific regions. Here is a depiction of George Washington. Many people believed that they should have George Washington serve as king. Eventually, he would be elected first president of the United States. Then we talk about slavery. Slavery was not invented by the United States. We didn't bring them here. We inherited slavery from our colonial oppressor, but we were here. How should the slaves be counted when it comes to representation? This was a question that came up in our constitutional era, especially as you had rival states, specifically New York and Virginia, that questioned each other's power. Virginia was by far the most populous state in the United States. New York was leery of that because a third of the people that lived in Virginia were slaves. Should you count the slaves as part of their population, and in doing so, you're going to inflate Virginia's power. If you don't count slaves, then you reduce Virginia's economic output and outlook, which would be an underrepresentation. Many people today see the solution as being some sort of racial comment. The solution over slavery and representation was the 3/5 clause. New York proposed that each slave in Virginia be counted as 3/5 of a person to counterbalance Virginia's representation in Congress. Many people today see that as being a way to dehumanize Black people or anything else like that. That was not the reason for it. Maybe there was a little bit of that. The real reason behind this 3/5 clause was to reduce the overrepresentation of power by Virginia in Congress, specifically warned by New Yorkers. So the 3/5 clause was almost entirely about representation and reducing Virginia's overrepresentation. That's the reason for the 3/5 clause. Okay. That also being said, speaking of slavery, in our framework, it would be determined in the Constitution that the national government for now is going to kick the can down the road, and we're just going to let states determine whether they want to emancipate slaves, end slavery, abolish it altogether, or maintain it or even grow it. So slavery in the initial Constitution, the federal government's not going to get involved. States, you do your thing. Massachusetts, if you want to abolish slavery, that's your right. South Carolina, if you want to maintain it or even expand it, that's your right. That's going to be determined later on. So in a room just like this one that you see here, you see folks presiding and attempting to sign the Constitution, but several things have to happen first. Because you have proponents of a centralized federal government, you have others known as anti-federalists who are leery that an overarching federal government could be too oppressively powerful and tyrannical. An overly centralized government would not have a granting of enough autonomy for not just its states, but also for its people. The Constitution didn't bear out in its framework of the government any sort of ruling about personal freedoms, anything along those lines. And so there would be compromises made at the time. But before the Constitution was ratified, to placate a lot of the fears of these anti-federalists, this was published, the Federalist Papers, which is a series of 85 essays written largely by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Alexander Hamilton wrote the majority of these essays. And what these Federalist Papers did was explain why having a strong centralized government was necessary and why it could serve as the glue for all Americans in a fledgling situation. We were a brand new country. We need something to keep us all together. We acknowledge that we're different, but here's why we need to band together, and this is how we do it. So in these 85 collection of essays, they explain why having a strong central government was necessary. That being said, these anti-federalists were still concerned about the overarching aspect of a central government. There would have to be a compromise to appease the anti-federalists because the anti-federalist faction was pretty strong across our new country. So how do you get enough of these anti-federalists on board to where they will ratify the Constitution, therefore we can move forward? That's where this was proposed. The Bill of Rights, which would be a series of 10 amendments to the Constitution. And these 10 amendments are going to determine unalienable rights of citizens, determine religious freedom, determine a right to free speech, right of freedom from self-prosecution, right to bear arms. The Bill of Rights was introduced as a series of 10 amendments to the proposed Constitution to guarantee personal liberties and freedom. The first 10 amendments, specifically the first one, guarantees a right to freedom of speech. If you want to scream at the top of your lungs that you hate Donald Trump, you're against this government, you hate it, okay. You have a right to protest and make your voice heard. As long as you're not violent or threatening, you have a right to express your displeasure with our government. If you say, I don't want Joe Biden, this, and that, you have a right to say that. And like I said, as long as you are not violent or threatening, you have a right to express your discontent with the government. That's guaranteed in the First Amendment. You have a right to bear arms, to own guns. There are questions about that to this day, However, our forefathers recognized a right to self-defense. The Fifth Amendment, you may have seen in various different TV shows and movies, somebody on the stand being questioned by an attorney. They ask a question, and the person on trial will say something like, "I plead the fifth," something like that. That's basically uh, the person on trial being asked the question, expressing their Fifth Amendment right not to incriminate themselves, also not to lie under oath, perjuring themselves. So, in other words, if you were somebody on trial and uh, an attorney was cross-examining you, and you say, "Did you murder this person?" You could say, "I plead the fifth," which is basically saying, I am legally not going to answer that question because I may or may not have done it, but by expressing my Fifth Amendment right, I'm not incriminating myself. I'm also not saying no, so I'm not lying under oath. So if I said no when very clearly I did it and I was found guilty, I could be sentenced to something further bad. But if you plead the fifth, you don't acknowledge a no or lying while also not saying yes. Those are the sorts of things that placated fears of anti-federalists, and eventually the Bill of Rights would be added to our Constitution, and this is how it was signed, right here. Okay? So from this standpoint, you are going to have a document signed, approved by delegates, sent to all the states to be ratified. And in doing so, you're going to create a national economy, a national market, if you will. You're going to strengthen the federal government to where it is now very obvious that we have a federal government. You will now know. You will now know who to turn to. Daniel Shays could be compensated for his promises. You are now going to have an official framework for government that can make good on all of these things and be the glue. Question about citizenship would now also be determined. Wouldn't be until the 14th Amendment that citizenship as you know it today would be determined. And to this day, there are questions about birthright citizenship and whatnot. However, who's an American? Who's a citizen? Should immigrants be citizens? Should slaves be citizens? Should Native Americans be citizens? These were all questions at the time that would be determined at a later date. But you're determining that everyone in the United States is, in fact, an American, including these Native Americans. It would be determined that maybe these Native Americans could be assimilated into white American society differently than perhaps others. And maybe some of these civilized tribes, particularly those in the American Southeast, the Creeks, the Seminoles, the Chickasaws, the Cherokees, and the Choctaws, they adopted some European civilized Western aspects and incorporated them into their cultures. Therefore, they'd be civilized. That being said, they were determined that they could be more assimilated than others. Ratifying the Constitution kind of was determined elsewhere. Various different regions, especially those in red, were leery of a strong central government. If you lived in the coast, maybe if you lived in a region where you had strong commerce, you wanted a federal government that was strong. If you lived out in the country, you didn't need the federal government breathing down your neck. So there would be questions in and about that. What do we do about black people? Should we emancipate them gradually? Should we import more of them from Africa? Should we increase slavery? What do we do with slavery? Are they here? And you can see in this graph populations. The further south you go, the more slaves there are, and as are they a larger percentage of their overall populations. So you can see in places like Massachusetts, in the first census of the United States, every 10 years there is to be a census taken. 2020 was the last one. We had one in 2010, 2000, 1990, and so on and so forth. 1790 was the first time it was taken. And in Massachusetts in 1790, 378,000 people, 0 slaves. You had 5,300 free people of color. So there's 5,300 black people that lived in Massachusetts. There may have once been slaves, but there wasn't a grand need for slavery in Massachusetts. It's not that you didn't have agriculture there. You certainly just didn't have the broader extent of it. You didn't need slave labor out in the fields. The further south you go, the larger percentage, and in particular, Virginia. So Virginia has 747,000 people, the most populous state at the time, 292,000 of which were slaves. Now you see why New York maybe have questioned why they were afraid of that. But otherwise, though, the further south you go, the more broad scale agriculture you're going to have. And so, yeah, Virginia, the Carolinas, places like Georgia, you're going to have a broader population of slaves because you're going to have more of an agricultural output there. And so, from that standpoint, it's going to affect people like Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a very wealthy Virginian, owned a lot of land, and by default, he owned a lot of slaves. That was very common in that era of American history for wealthy landowners to own African slaves. He's no exception. Matter of fact, he had a number of illegitimate children with some of his African slaves. That being said, Thomas Jefferson had somewhat of a conflicted view of slavery. And in some ways, he was somewhat ambivalent about it. He was conflicted with how he viewed it. Because Thomas Jefferson, though he owned slaves, would eventually free some of them. He believed that slavery ultimately was wrong. And he believed that slaves should eventually be emancipated. However, that does not mean that he believed that black people could assimilate into American society. So whether it was an inferiority issue or a lack of belief that black people could assimilate into American society, unlike Native Americans perhaps, Thomas Jefferson somewhat believed in the idea of colonization. Maybe African slaves could be sent back to Africa. They could be freed, and maybe they can go back home. Problem, uh, many of these slaves had come from generations of slavery. The only thing African about them is their DNA. Otherwise, many of them were born into slavery, as were their parents and grandparents before them and whatnot. And so there was a bit of confliction. Thomas Jefferson believed that they should eventually be freed gradually. But he also didn't believe they could assimilate, whether it was inferiority or otherwise. And so, from that standpoint, these were questions about slavery that the Constitution did not address at that time. But Thomas Jefferson was pretty typical of that era in that he was conflicted. You had a number of ambivalence about slavery. But from that standpoint, that's where they were. That's chapter 7, guys. Look out for chapter 8. We'll see you soon. And there we go.